Welcome, everyone. Very glad to have you all here with us. Yes, to your question, you are automatically muted while I'm screen sharing. I can't always see your messages, but we will have moments to pause in between. So we are in a webinar format. Welcome. And very excited to be welcoming back Michelle Lebrun, who is going to be speaking about understanding intergenerational trauma from a Mi'kmaq perspective. And I want to invite us first to begin with a land acknowledgement. So at the bottom right, you will see a link, placenames.mapdev.ca, but you can also just go to Google and type out the name of where you are physically located and find out the name in the Mi'kmaq language so that we can really join together as uninvited settlers, as people who are living on this beautiful territory that is Mi'kmaqi, that we can really use the names of where we are located. So I want to invite you to please join me in the chat. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki. This is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the Peace and Friendship Treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and we commit to unlearning. Let us take this moment to pause in gratitude for all of the wise Mi'kmaq elders and Ilnu community leaders who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this work. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world. Let us take this moment to commit to justice and healing. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all human beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here, as well as an expression of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we all must begin to learn and honor. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. Walalu. Thank you all. I am going to stop my slideshow and I am going to invite Michelle, who many of you may already know. Michelle is amazing, and really, I haven't stopped thinking about her presentation from last month when she shared a little bit about her wisdom. And so I've been counting down the seconds. I know many of you have as well, for her to be joining us. So Michelle, if you don't mind maybe saying a few words about yourself to introduce yourself while I get our your PowerPoint up and running.
Mm. Really Win. Thank you for inviting me back. Feel really humbled to have this opportunity um, to share and to learn from one another. And I'm not an expert by any means. I'm just a Mi'kmaq woman who's experiencing much of the same in the community and have the opportunity to share what I've been seeing in the communities. So, my name is Michelle LeBrun. I'm Mi'kmaq from Pictou First Nations, sometimes known as Fisher's Grant. Uh, I am engaged to an amazing man. We have 7 kids between us. Um, and I'm in private practice here. I've worked across the entire spectrum of clinical services from not for profit to provincial to federal, and now into private practice. So I've had the opportunity to see how delivering services to Indigenous communities can look depending on, I guess, whose organization you're representing. And for me, what I have found is that private practice really uh, provides me the best opportunity to support Indigenous communities. And so I've been doing this counseling work for approximately, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, maybe more, if I really think about it. Uh, I'm a descendant of residential schools, and my mom has done tremendous amount of work around supporting survivors here in the community. And I've learned so much from the survivors and our elders and knowledge keepers over the years, and feel this has really informed my practice. Um, and also just live in the legacy of that historical trauma, witnessing it every day in my work in the communities that I serve. That has really informed my practice as a clinician. And so in my PhD work, that's what I really hope to, I guess, uncover is like what is really needed to support Indigenous people in this work that I do. And hopefully it will provide some sort of insight for others to consult and perhaps make it their own as well. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of intergenerational trauma. It's something that we hear, a term that's kind of bounced around a lot. And I think over time, words can actually lose meaning. So I just want to take this opportunity to kind of slow us down a little bit and um, to really take a moment to pause and reflect on what that actually looks like from a Mi'kmaq perspective. And of course, Indigenous people are not the only people that experience intergenerational trauma. Um, but today, I'll just speak from my own perspective. So that's a little bit about me. That's my logo for my business. My business is Etli and Pizimkik. It's a little bit of a tongue twister when you're not used to seeing it and reading it or saying it. And I hesitated for a second there to put it into English. But one of the ways that we really need to start decolonizing Mi'kmaqi and the way that we think and do things is really just stop backing off from things that challenge us. So this was one thing that I really wanted to convey because through the language, there's a whole different meaning, which we'll learn about today a little bit in the presentation. But Eli in Pacific really means where I go to heal. And that's what I hope to promote in my private practice is a safe place a culturally informed place where Indigenous people can feel they can be their true self and work on that healing together. So, intergenerational trauma. Trauma is experienced for Indigenous people through colonial violence over the years. It really sometimes people tend to think of trauma as beginning during residential schools or Indian day schools, but really, intergenerational trauma began at the beginning of colonial history when there was this disruption of thousands of years of, healthy communities and um, the indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world. But really, it was intensified through the process of colonial violence, the colonial narrative, the curriculum, residential schools, Indian day schools really reinforce that. And even today, the curriculum really reflects the Western narrative about everything. Added to that, the 60 scoops, the missing and murdered, all of these things that maybe we didn't personally experience, but through the stories and also the legacy and the impact that it's had on individuals, that distressing situation negatively impacts multiple generations. And that's what we refer to as intergenerational. So the impact that that trauma has is felt physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And there has been some research to even suggest that descendants experience significant intergenerational trauma, almost to the point of their parents. So I just wanted to start by looking at this little quote on the side, on the left hand. It says, "It's crucial to acknowledge the harms done to Indigenous peoples in Canada and to understand the cumulative effects of intergenerational trauma, how they continue to impact the cultural, social, and economic realities of many Indigenous people today. And there is no excuse for expecting Indigenous people to do the emotional labor of explaining this to others." So, because we all have this responsibility, what I'm giving here today is just the beginning of a dialogue that should happen, and a beginning of our own deconstructing and challenging our understanding of this colonial narrative that has been impacting Indigenous people in this country for hundreds of years. Okay. And I really want this to be an opportunity for people to have a discussion. And so there is a chat box there. I'd really like you guys to participate or make comments along the way, or if you have that aha moment, please share that with the group because we're learning together. There's a really important quote here that I want to start by saying. "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." So when we take a look at that, it really is about how that oppression has been internalized and interpreted, right? The only way to undo that harm is to be able to understand the impact that that trauma has had on us. And today we're going to look at this from the Indigenous perspective, the Mi'kmaq perspective. We'll be looking at, we'll be using the medicine wheel as our guide to really unpack what intergenerational trauma looks like in our communities. Okay. There's a concept that will guide our work. In Mi'kmaq, it's called Imsa Norma. This means all my relations, and maybe a lot of folks here are familiar with that term, but it just doesn't mean all my relations. The language is very important because it's very difficult to translate into English the true meaning of Mi'kmaq language because the English language tends to be very heavily noun based, whereas the Indigenous mindset is really about that ebb and flow, the energy, the spirituality, how things are connected and interconnected. And that's what Imsa Noema really stresses, that we were all connected, we're all interdependent, and this includes our past, our present, and our future, that all creation, regardless of what it may be, is all interconnected, that there is a creator, and that we are connected physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So it's important for us to keep this in mind because sometimes we're looking at things in silos and we're looking at things individually, but the Indigenous mindset is really about how we are connected and not isolated in that process. That can be difficult sometimes to remind ourselves in this work, but we have an accountability and a responsibility to ourselves, to the creator, to each other. We're all connected in this web of life. We all have gifts, we all have a place, and we need to help each other in this process. So that's what Imsanoloma is really emphasizing when we say that. So today we'll look at how the medicine wheel can guide our work, and really unpack the way that intergenerational trauma is experienced in the communities. So before we start, are there any questions there?
So I'm going to actually stop screen share because I can't see. So I just see that your comment about relations as a verb being interpreted. So that's, anyone have any other questions or comments?
Before we continue about just the concept of Imsanoloma, that's good. It's good to keep that in mind as we move along through the presentation.
And know that we will continue to do this periodically. So if you want to think about it and get back, we will come back to you. The connectedness of all people is very similar to Buddhism, is one comment.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll begin, and if there's questions along the way, we'll go to the next slide. So we'll look at things again from that physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspect of self, because when we think about that medicine wheel that we were looking at, that is what we are made up of. There's no way to separate just or isolate just one. We are impacted on this level. And in my work, I really try to not just help people understand themselves on these planes, but I also look at how the treatment can be designed in such a way that it supports them on their journey in a holistic way. So I'm just going to name some things off. And of course, some of the things that I talk about here can fit in more than one category. But I want to just give some insight in terms of what internalized trauma might look like in a person. So physically, there could be some form of self-harming. This could be in their eating, perhaps in their hygiene, cutting, self-denial, things like that. Could be about acting on suicidal thoughts and behaviors, poor coping, which could lead to all sorts of things, right? It could be, I don't want to, I hesitate here because I don't want to enforce stereotypes, right? I'm just giving some examples of what poor coping might be like. So it could lead us to all sorts of different things, such as addictions or drinking, and just not being able to cope in general. It can also lead to things like overachieving, extreme forms of exercising, overworking, things like that. Feeling competitiveness because you're under this constant threat of, that maybe you'll be fired if you don't rise above, or, always feeling like there's this, there's a lack of resources, a lack of opportunities. So things like that. It could all get translated down instead of having an understanding of how that trauma is impacting us. Like sometimes we act out on that. Also, it can create a lack of boundaries. So even in our personal relationships, our friendships, with parents, with children, with our partners, at work, I use the word of people pleasing, like always trying to rise to the occasion and try to make sure that everything is under control and that people are happy and so forth. So it creates this feeling inside yourself that there's this urgency to kind of keep the calm and keep people happy. It creates um, an issue of lateral violence in our communities, lashing out and gossiping and things like of that nature. Also, it can create feelings of like the hopelessness, and that's where we start to see people neglecting maybe their physical health or their mental health, or um, you know, it just creates that feeling within a person. Also, uh, when there's a lot of this internalized trauma, there's poverty and other issues in the community are really prevalent. Physically as well, when we have a lot of this internalized trauma, this can lead to illness. So we talk about cancer and diabetes and gastrointestinal um, issues, inflammatory diseases such as arthritis and so forth. Your blood pressure could be high. This could lead to cardiac issues. So internalized trauma has many implications on the physical self. And so I know it's going to be some heavy conversation this morning, but we really need to have an understanding of how it impacts us on these levels. Emotionally, internalized trauma can look like emotional dysregulation, especially when we look at little children who don't perhaps have the insight as to why they're feeling what they're feeling. They're carrying a lot of that into the school, and they have high degrees of anxiety and so forth. And they're not able to regulate or understand why they feel the way they feel or what's going on in the community, etc. It can lead to depressive suicidal thoughts and ideation, feelings of being unlovable, unforgivable, never feeling good enough. Um, it, this trauma can lead to strong feelings of shame about who you are as an Indigenous person. And you can also even feel embarrassed or ashamed because you don't speak your language or you're afraid to make mistakes and be mocked. Also, like the even as far as ceremony and culture is concerned, like you may feel like it's um, it's wrong or it's not right, or there, you feel shy, etc. And then this leads to feeling lost or not having a place of belonging, and that can have really devastating consequences on the individual. Also, what tends to happen is we start to, I put the word attribute, the impact of trauma to something innate, like the deficiency model, right? There's something about me that's not good. There's something broken. Um, I'm acting this way. I feel this way. I'm not making good choices, etc. So that just reinforces the whole impact of the trauma. And this can lead to anxiety, PTSD, depression, labeling. So the labeling of people can be very devastating when it's not informed from our perspectives, because a lot of the time what we're seeing is the impact of trauma and really misunderstanding um, what that really looks like in individuals. So hopefully today things seem a little bit more clear as we kind of move along through this. We'll move to the next one. So internalized trauma from the mental perspective, of course, like when the limbic system is flooded because of that trauma, this can make it difficult to concentrate, to focus, to have good memory recall, to formulate our words. It's once that is kind of flipped, we're not able to really access that part of our brain that helps us to do all of those functions. And so sometimes that's really misinterpreted, but um, that will lead a lot of times to children being put on IPP plans, etc. But uh, when when we have this like this mental block, that makes it difficult for Indigenous people to buy into the Western colonial treatment plan, right? About their story, because they don't really feel like it fits what they're going through. They feel like there's not an understanding of their own lived experience. So that's when we start to see low attendance for programming, for counseling, um, that buying in to the treatment plan or the colonial narrative about their lives. And then that leads to kind of like poor outcomes, right? In judgments on our part, unfortunately, which continues to perpetuate the colonial harm in our communities. So it can be really devastating for Indigenous people. Believe in the colonial narrative about about themselves and their history and their people, um, and then almost living out the character that's ascribed to them through this labeling process. And Eduardo Duran would call that almost like a naming ceremony. Um, so we label, and then they start to take on the features of that character. It's difficult for Indigenous people to externalize the trauma and its impacts and put the responsibility and the understanding to where it needs to be. So they end up internalizing it, right? As if it were the truth about their story, even though they know that it's not reflective of their real life and their experiences in life. But if you're told something long enough, you kind of buy into it, right? And we've seen that in multiple situations. Spiritually, uh, individuals begin to feel disconnected and ashamed about spirituality, and for a lot of folks, they don't know which form of spirituality they should gravitate to, because there's a lot of historical shame attached to Indigenous ceremonies, but there's also a lot of shame attached to Christianity and just spirituality in general. So a lot of folks don't know really where to go spiritually. And so this creates this disconnect. And for us to be well and balanced, remember that we need to be well from all of those perspectives, including spirituality. So this can be very troubling for an individual. So there's a lot of anger and deep pain associated with residential schools, day schools, etc. Not just because of Christianity, but because of being separated and not knowing where to go. There are knowledge keepers and elders in our communities, but a lot of the older generation that carry these knowledges are getting up there, and uh, I wouldn't say that there is like nobody taking it up from the younger generations, but we need to support and encourage more to learn from our older ones before that elder takes that knowledge with them when they pass. There's also a lot of shame, confusion, etc., around not knowing the culture. And the linguisticide that has happened across Fertile Island has been internalized on a really large scale as well. Like, because through the language conveys a very different meaning. And we talk about the Indigenous worldview, but through the language, we really get a different understanding of the Mi'kmaq ways of knowing and being in the world. So the language is really critical to understanding the Indigenous uh, frame of mind. And so we have to do everything we can to bring back that language, but there's a lot of shame as well of not knowing your language. And most people are very shy to try to learn the language because they are just worried about being ridiculed, etc. So I know as a descendant, my mom thought that it was in my best interest to learn English, even though my family was fluent. And every single day, I think about the fact that I can't speak fluently. And it really creates a barrier, especially in this work, when I'm trying to work with fluent speakers who really have the desire to do their counseling in their own language. So they're they're looking for that connection, but there's that gap, I guess. So I'm trying to learn the language, which I think will really help me to do the work better. There's a concept in Mi'kmaq, Umnuitism means the Mi'kmaq way of knowing. And through the Mi'kmaq perspective and way of knowing, we understand the world on a much more holistic level, one that is um, more spiritual and energetic and ebbs and flows. And it's uh, it's really critical to understanding, especially our older ones, the fluent speakers. So uh, spiritually, um, I would say we've lost the relationship, but the relationship to the land, water, and the celestial, the sky world has really been, this has been really, I wouldn't say, I use the word broken. It has been broken, but it's not lost. It was taken from us in so many ways through resettlement and uh, through trauma and so forth. But we really need to have that connection back to the land, to the medicines, to the water, and even the celestials. Um, Mi'kmaq people were highly spiritual people, so um, bringing back these ways, I think, is really the key to addressing intergenerational trauma. The breakdown in spirituality has really impacted families and communities. It's created a feeling of disconnect, not knowing where we fit in our communities. And this is especially felt with our men. Our men have been really disconnected from their children, from their communities, from knowing uh, where they where they fit in that big web of life, really. And so, yeah, spirituality really includes us taking a look at all of these elements and encouraging the uh, uh, we want to bring back these ways so that we can include spirituality in everyday work with social work, if that makes sense. So trying to think about the word Oloism and trying to translate that into a way that makes sense in English. Okay, we'll move on. So it's not all heaviness. I just want to give some suggestions for hopeful considerations, right? It's important for us to remember that we are not just our trauma. And that has to be emphasized throughout, that everything that we've been through in life um, that has created this trauma can be healed when it's done from the Indigenous perspective. And an elder recently told me, the culture, the language, the ceremonies, the knowledge, it's not gone, it's not lost, it is here, but we are the ones that are lost, right? We are the ones that need to reconnect while these elders and knowledge keepers are here. We need to reconnect because this is the time where we're no longer prohibited to do those things. So we have to take advantage of the opportunity as well. And for social workers that are not Mi'kmaq or not Indigenous, you have a very important role to play. Because with cultural humility, this positions you as a learner instead of an expert. And it gives you the opportunity to learn alongside and from the communities that you serve with through our elders and knowledge keepers who are willing to share, and also how important it is for us to do our own education. So to learn from the TRC, the 94 calls to action, most people have not really taken a real good look at that, but I think it really should inform all of our practice as social workers. Get familiar with what's going on in the communities. What are the challenges, such as the missing and murdered? Also, look at the treaties because we are all treaty people. The biggest thing about connecting with our communities is just to be present and take the initiative to get to know people, have those conversations, and be open to having tea with community members and to listen to stories. And it's so important that in our work that we challenge our colonial and Western narratives about everything, about what practices are best suited to work with Indigenous people, that we are the expert in people's lives, that, the colonial narrative is the truth of the history of Canada. And these are all things that we need to challenge in our everyday work. And re-educate ourselves, right? Dismantle everything that maybe we've been fed through that curriculum, and start re-educating through sources that reflect the voices of the communities that we serve. And so there's a few books that I want to share. Indian School Road. That's talks about the residential school here in Nova Scotia. The TRC.
I'm going to be writing down here as you speak. So Indian Road.
Yeah, Indian School Road by Chris Benjamin. And the TRC, absolutely, it's a must read for everybody, but especially for those doing social work here in Mi'kmaq. Also, we have to look at how the Indian Act today is still impacting Indigenous peoples and communities today. It's this is still alive and well, and it is making havoc in our communities. So understanding how those bigger political structures and all of those intersecting things impact communities and make it difficult, that's really important for us to do. And I also am showing you Dr. Marie Baptiste, her book on living treaties. And this is just a couple of books. There's so many I could recommend, but maybe if the group wants to share some of their work as well, that they've used to inform their social work practice, I think that would be great.
And we are thinking about doing a book club, y'all. So be mindful if you're interested in this to join me. Yeah, reach out.
So I know, like, everything that we kind of talked about was really heavy. We talked about the physical, the mental, emotional, and spiritual impacts of intergenerational trauma. And it's very difficult for people to kind of step outside themselves and look back and see themselves in light of how that trauma has been impacting them. So I think social work practice includes the need for us to be able to recognize what intergenerational trauma looks like with our clients and the communities and families that we work with, so that not that we're going to become the expert and say, oh, this is this and this is this, but rather just create a atmosphere where, you know, learning can happen, and being supportive through that process is really important. um, I say in the slide that you don't have to be the expert, and that's really important for us to remember. You don't have to know everything, but what we need in this work is cultural humility and the ability to challenge maybe what we think we know and look for ways to educate ourselves from the Mi'kmaq perspective, right? So to do that, we want to listen to the voices of our elders in our communities. We want to listen to our we want to even listen to our clients because they are the expert in their lives, right? We want to really pay attention to um, some of those suggestions, because many of our clients know what they need in order to be well. They just need to be supported and guided through that process. Um, Eduardo Duran has a book called Healing the Soul Wound, and he talks about that trauma has resulted in the soul wounding of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. So every time that you have this experience of trauma or re-traumatizing, and the re-traumatizing happens because our communities are so connected across Turtle Island, that what happens in one community has so much impact on other individuals and communities. And so the retelling of people's trauma, or when you encounter another suicide, another uh, violent policing event in a community, or any of that stuff, just knowing what other communities and individuals are going through brings back the reminder of your own trauma. It surfaces all that trauma again, and it makes it very difficult. So in our communities, we have very complex, compact trauma that's passed down intergenerationally, and it impacts us on a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual level. And when you're surrounded by a lot of folks that are in that um, same position, it's very difficult to heal, but not impossible. So an elder recently told me that your life is a ceremony, and the way that you live your life is a ceremony. And those are not just metaphors for the Indigenous person. It's really true. How you live is the ceremony. So the healing of trauma requires Indigenous people to engage in a soul retrieving ceremony. That is like, um, it's a process of decolonizing, and it's a process of reclaiming who we are as Indigenous people on a healthy level, healing that trauma, reconnecting to culture and ceremony and language, reconnecting with our communities and our elders and our families, getting back to uh, being healthy communities and healthy individuals. And that is completely possible. Like, we we don't want to take that medical model of pathologizing people's trauma to be interpreted as something is wrong with the individual. We want to look at how all of these things have made it impossible not impossible, that's not the word, have made it very difficult for our people to be well and our communities to be healthy. So that is that's really important to do in our work, is just to try to keep that perspective. Social work must be rooted and guided by the Indigenous worldview and practices. So if you're not familiar with what that looks like, reach out to communities, reach out to elders, knowledge keepers, be present at community events, educate yourself as much as you can. So you don't need to be an expert, but you should know how to support clients in accessing what's available in our communities, and also just be open to thinking about how the work might look from the Indigenous perspective. So yeah, it's that cultural humility that will open up our hearts and be willing to look outside of our own maybe area of expertise to be taught something new. So that is the PowerPoint that I had prepared for today, but I'm also able to just expand on some particular aspects of the presentation if there's any questions.
So Llewellyn, thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions. So the first question that's in the question and answer, so I'm going there first just because it's easier to see. Is there a way to make an IEP more cultural, or how can we get a quote unquote disengaged student quote unquote back on track?
Maybe the student isn't off track. Maybe the environment is what's off track. So that and a lot of our classrooms are really set up in ways that are not culturally responsive for students. So it's not just the curriculum, but it may be our teaching methods. It could be the environment itself. It's a lot of the curriculum does not reflect the lived reality of our people. And so they don't see themselves reflected in the education. It's not reflective of maybe a lot of the cultural practices or the language or anything that they're familiar with from their home or their community. So we just have to be aware of that first of all, and think about how can we make this environment a place that's culturally inclusive or culturally reflective of the kids that are here. And also, when we start to take that for granted that it's not the classroom, there's something going on with the child, it's almost like a naming ceremony for that child, right? That you have to fit into here, and if you don't, then there's something wrong with you, right? And then we start to look at pathologizing the behaviors, or maybe there's a lot going on in the community that they don't know how to talk about, or they don't know how to express or how to regulate. So they're coming to school with anxiety, and they're coming to school with the impact of trauma, right? What they're dealing with at home, and school is not always a safe place to be, unfortunately, right? So I think the first thing that we need to do is, just like in social work practice, we have to start challenging, our assumptions about a lot of this stuff, and start to decolonize the way that we think about the practice and how we're delivering education or support or treatment plans, and really inform it from the Indigenous perspective, or at least do our very best to try to think beyond our own worldview. I don't know if that answers the question, but I just wanted
start.
to
We have two more questions before we run out of time. One is wanting to understand, like you use the word ceremony a lot, and not necessarily being familiar with that concept because in a Euro-Western world, ceremony probably that word might mean different things to us. And
Yeah.
then there's another comment that's really awesome. It sounds like looking at the impact of colonialism on ourselves and perhaps our own experience of intergenerational trauma or intersectionality and acting to heal from it is also an important part of our self-care as social workers so that we can raise awareness and not reinforcing and contributing to the traumatic experience of those we work with. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, we've all been impacted by this colonial narrative, the unquestioned narrative of about what's the truth. And I think we all benefit when we start to uh, be informed and decolonize the way that we've been thinking about everything, right? Not just our practice, but just
Okay.
just life in general, and look for opportunities to learn from other people. Let their voices uh, speak for their own experiences. I think that's really important instead of imposing, um, what's been written or what gets published is often thought about as like what is the truth, but there's so many people's voices that are silenced in the process. And so, yeah, I think you would do so well to decolonize your own um, understanding and the way that you do the work, if that makes sense.
I think it does. And I am grateful to you for all that you have shared. Hopefully you can pick up on some of the love that's being thrown to you in the webinar. We will be having an opportunity to continue learning with Michelle. She will be doing a third part of the this learning in June. And actually we will be featuring some of her wisdom and insight in our upcoming Connection magazine, where we will be focusing on decolonization and what that means. But I hope that you just take in this love. I am going to stop the recording as we get ready to have Suzanne join us for a little bit of prize. I told you if you stayed, you get to have a prize. We actually have a couple of prizes. So Michelle Willalin, please take in some of the love that's coming your way. And we are very grateful to you for your time and wisdom.
Thank you. Could I just say one last thing real quick?
Please. Oh my gosh, of course.
I In saying everything that we said today, it's really heavy stuff. And two things that I want you to take away from it: the importance of, self-care now, that you're feeling this heaviness, because I don't want you to walk away thinking, um, you know, that there's no hope. There's lots of hope here. We have to be aware. And the other thing is too, it's not about guilt, it's about awareness. And sometimes people feel guilty about the history of this country. Um, it's just about we can use that into something that informs our practice. We can take that feelings of uncomfortableness or, not wanting to repeat that harm and turn it into something positive. It can inform our practice in a good way. So I just wanted to leave that there, that please take care of yourself if this has raised a lot of, you know, challenging emotions, because that certainly is a part of the process here as well.
Absolutely. I'm feeling like as a college, we need to start thinking about it. We talk a lot about trauma informed, but I think we also need shame informed.
Yeah.
So more to come. And apparently a lot of people want a book club. So stay tuned on that front. We will. And we actually have a book to give you all for not all of you, but inspire the rest of you to go out and buy it. We've got a prize. So I'm going to stop recording and hand it over to Suzanne so that she can tell us about that.